Hi, welcome back to the Expanded Animation Symposium. We will continue our exciting real-time panel with two more talks. The first talk will be given by the art collective Total Refusal, presented by Leonhard Müller and Michael Stump. In the talk, they will challenge commercial video game aesthetics and narratives. And as in the previous panel, I would like to encourage the audience to raise questions in our live chat, and so that we can have a vivid discussion in our Q&A session. So thank you, and let's start the presentation.
Hello, my name is Michael, and this here is Leon. Together with Robin Klengel, we are part of the artists and research collective Total Refusal.
Over the last 2 decades, video games have dropped most of their former boys' room stigmata and have evolved into one of the most relevant segments of media entertainment. Revenue-wise, they have long left the film and music industries behind. As products of our culture, they sit at the focal point of countless media and societal studies and are appropriated and recirculated by artists and media content creators alike. One such form of appropriation, which has seen enormous spread over the last 10 years, is the Machinima, a film made within video games.
While content production within video games comes in many forms, most commonly in the form of gameplay streams called Let's Plays, machinimas follow a structure specific to films or shows. Most of them use game resources in order to tell stories, many of which are not grounded in the game's own narratives. One game which has seen particular interest in the scene of machinima artists is Rockstar Studios' blockbuster Grand Theft Auto V, which ranks third on the list of top-selling video games with 135 million copies sold according to the gaming platform IGN. In all probability, it's among the most successful in-game studios for streamers, machinima creators and game artists, as well as experimental filmmakers working with this medium. There are a multitude of reasons that so many filmmakers are drawn into GTA V's fictional city of Los Santos. And today, we'd like to single out one of these reasons and talk a little bit about hyperrealism and its relevance to video games and their artistic appropriation.
In the realm of arts, the term hyperrealism is most commonly used to describe a genre of painting and sculpting which aims to produce works resembling high-resolution photographs. In contrast to photorealism, however, hyperrealism tries to go beyond the mere depiction of the real by utilizing techniques that create an illusion which is more real than reality. Jean Baudrillard described hyperrealism as the simulation of something which never really existed. Before we translate this to the realm of games, let's take a step away from painting and sculpture and look at hyperrealism as a general concept.
Hyperrealistic visuals typically appear like literal depictions of reality which are too perfect to actually be real. Selectively, some of their characteristics are intensified in order to turn the depicted objects into more than they truthfully were. Horst Bredekamp thus defines the term hyperrealism by quote-unquote a paradoxical existence, incorporating both compression and revelation by magnification. In a sense, one could say that hyperrealism attempts not to depict the reality of a certain object, but rather its idea. Hyperrealism displays archetypical ideas as reality, and thus manages to correspond even more with our concept of reality than reality itself. And following that notion, it could be asked whether hyperrealism constitutes the visual order of reality.
In semiotics, and postmodern theory. Hyperrealism is constituted by the lack of clear separation between the real and the simulated. This notion hints at a special relationship between hyperrealism and capitalism. Isn't hyperrealism as a general concept even more so than romanticism the language of choice for waving consumerist mythology? Not only does hyperrealism contract objects to their distilled idea, it manages to do so while convincing us that we're still dealing with real objects. The very concept of contemporary marketing photography and videography is to portray a real which has been contracted to mythology as reality. This constitutes hyperrealism as a key mechanic of consumerism, leading us to adapt hyperreal ideals and to seek fulfillment through simulacra. Jean Baudrillard characterized the simulacrum as a sign no longer referring to its referent, but rather to itself, thus emancipating itself from the referent. This is easily illustrated in the context of consumerism. Most products have no inherent reason to hold the values we attribute to them, but their mythology has been part of our communication networks for so long that they have become self-sufficient in the establishment of those values.
Now, let's get back on topic. Video games are hyper-realistic spaces full of simulacra. In the case of GTA 5, this hyper-realism is twofold. Like in many contemporary games, it's present in a visual sense. Every sunset in GTA 5 is the perfect sunset. But more importantly, it's also present in a narrative sense.
In GTA 5, players take control over 3 gangsters from different social standings: an Afro-American from the lower class, a deranged alcoholic hillbilly, and a newly rich family father bored with everyday life. For different reasons, to strike it rich, out of fatigue caused by late capitalism normality, and for the sake of the old times, they decided to jump into a criminal career. To get their thrill fix, they rob banks and mess with bad guys, including a Mark Zuckerberg lookalike. All this takes place in the city of Los Santos and its surrounding countryside, featuring a diverse natural landscape. The city's architecture is inspired by physical reality to varying degrees. On his website, User350 has recorded 159 examples of real Los Angeles buildings created in GTA 5 in various levels of detail. Importantly, GTA 5's story takes place in a modern-day setting, using a hyperrealistic approach to display modern-day phenomena. The streets of Los Santos drown in a sea of cars honking at each other. Homeless people dumpster dive in back alleys. A wealthy psychotherapist parks his convertible in the driveway of his seaside apartment.
The world of GTA 5 is not a simulation of reality rather than a hyperreal city, a city of ideas. Most of these ideas are familiar to us. It'll come easy to most of us to immerse ourselves within them. They bring the game world to life through countless small narratives overlapping each other, most of which act as references to real-world values and problems: racism, consumerism, corruption. Los Santos itself isn't Los Angeles, but rather its digital simulacrum. It is filled with signs which, as a result of their reiteration and variation, have developed lives of their own within the pop cultural sphere. With its pop cultural references and quotes, it's a pastiche powerful enough that its own quotes have become quotable sources. In this context, the term pastiche refers to a self-sustaining imitation, requiring players to be in the know about its reference, as its similarity might not always be obvious. Robin J.S. Sloan defines the video game pastiche as something, 1, containing a broad area of game references, and 2, prompting players to make use of their knowledge about video game history in order to appreciate these references.
And then, of course, there are GTA 5's real-world references to people like Zuckerberg, corporations like private military contractor Blackwater, and the brutal cynicism of high-ranked police officers, which give the game its subversive character. Performing a tightrope walk between hyperrealistic depiction and humorous exaggeration, GTA 5 manages to harbor an inherent criticism of the values driving its stories. The game is, in this sense, to be understood as a Marxist critique of capitalism. Alan Butler, who, in his work Down and Out in Los Santos, presented a series of images portraying the homeless and lower classes of the city, notes the following.
Engaging with a corporate virtual reality like GTA 5's world presented a number of interesting propositions. This was around 2014 to 2016, so the world was changing too. I think the way the virtual world was beginning to erupt, leak, and poison the real world allowed for a popular critical use of video game simulations. In the post-truth Trump world, the virtual appears as the real. It makes sense to me that I should go deep into the virtual in an attempt to find a moment of reality. Video games like GTA have become these quasi-Marxist critiques of late-stage capitalist society, so I think they are perfect spaces to examine these ideas.
GTA 5 is a typical capitalist paradox. In other words, it is both a criticism of capitalism and an entertainment consumer product, and thus part of the logic of capitalist exploitation. As an all-encompassing system, capitalism doesn't allow the existence of anything outside itself. This entails that even criticism of capitalism isn't just tolerated, but rather an intended part of the capitalist exploitation loop. Both the eco-movement as well as the art scene are two prominent examples for that. In any case, its contemporary setting and hyperrealist character make GTA 5 fertile ground for critical appropriation.
As pointed out earlier, this has given rise to a plethora of works by artists and the gaming community which challenge the values negotiated in GTA 5 and thus link the digital pastiche back to the aspects of the physical real world, such as social upheavals.
This isn't just done in the form of machinimas, but also through modifications of the game, so-called mods in short. Anne-Marie Schleiner attributes a subversive potential to video game mods and calls games a host in which modders can nest their mods into. GTA 5's diverse arena of socio-political images in which critical and political narratives can unfold has seen quite a lot of further development through community mods. For example, the community's resourcefulness in trying to enthuse their fellow players has been used to showcase the potential effects on natural catastrophes and climate change on the capitalist world of Los Santos. In No Water plus Tsunami plus Atlantis by script mods, the ocean is dried out, leaving behind a desert of mud and garbage in the city's many harbors and beaches, while Bone 35's Tsunami mod drowns the entire metropolis in salt water, with whales swimming between the submerged skyscrapers.
As pointed out, the game has been an equally prominent set for machinimas and other artistic appropriation. In the case of such projects, artists face a particular challenge. In order to be relevant as a critique, their appropriation of the game must go beyond marveling at the hyperrealist scenery and instead utilize or deconstruct it.
Ismail Chauffry-Chantoundi's project Swatted from 2018 presents a case of aesthetics and content intertwining without being didactical. This machinima explores the form of content of the medium. On the narrative level, Chantoundi's film reflects upon the swatting phenomenon, a byproduct of gaming and streaming culture. It deconstructs the game's visual magic through a commissioned mod that dissolves hyperreality into technical drawings. Police and vehicles patrol the emptiness of the virtual sky. In this context, hyperrealism exerts the same type of fascination we experience through the weightlessness of dreams. It is precisely this vast realm of possibilities, enabling the creation of hyperreal representations of the supernatural, that sucks the artist and the observer into the medium. One could call it the esotericism of algorithms, which is at the same time used and uncovered by Chantoundi's work. Stefan Schwingeler describes the fundamental attitude of artistic usage of video games as a tendency to act against the effort of the game to be transparent and to blur the perception of the virtual world. Chantoundi's Swatted is a pristine example of this observation, even though in this case the artistic intervention is not limited to a disruption of perception. Swatted does not tip over into the surreal. Instead, the partial dissolution of the game environment and its physical laws combined with the coalescence of the narrative, gameplay and reality create an associative space that enables a far-reaching intrusion into the digital world.
Alan Butler documents the simulacrum of social relations in his photos and videographies. In Down and Out of Los Santos, he captures images of the marginalized and the politically forgotten using an in-game smartphone camera feature. Like in Social Reports, inspired by ethnographic practices, the videography works principally through the non-intervention of the author in the scenery. He does not attempt to contact the NPCs, rather he captures their routine. Between 2015 and 2019, the artist uploaded close to 2,000 pieces of content, mostly picture and video snippets, onto different social media outlets and onto his personal, dedicated website. Butler describes his subjects, in essence the homeless or alcoholics, in relation to their role in the gameplay as quote-unquote ambient human presences. He explains his concept as follows. Through performative engagement with the uncanny simulations of society's most vulnerable, Down and Out in Los Santos aims to unearth the viewer's empathy and humanity through manipulative photographic tropes. Alan Butler uses the hyperrealistic prestige of Los Santos to research the effect of media politics on gamers and observers alike. The integration of poor and vulnerable people into the game landscape is not an innocent piece of environmental storytelling.
John Delappe's work allegedly takes a very different artistical approach. A mod specifically developed for the project takes the central role, using a live stream of the game to visualize data collected from outside the game. So, in the case of Allegedly, the video is the direct product of a mod. Furthermore, the artist doesn't counteract the violence typically associated with the medium in order to use it for a peaceful narration. Rather, the opposite is the case. For the duration of a year, starting on Independence Day 2018, Delapes custom mod made use of GTA 5 to visualize the amount of gun murders which took place over the time period in the United States. For every murder listed in the gun violence archive, the mod spawned a non-playable character, an artificial intelligence-controlled character in the streets of Los Santos, programmed to gun down other similar artificial intelligence-controlled characters, so-called NPCs. The ensuing gunfights could be watched as a Twitch livestream for the duration of the project. On his website, Delapes categorizes LHC as a pilot project in the field of data visualization within computer games. The video stream is accompanied by the first radio recording of God Bless America, sung in 1938 by Kate Smith and played here in an infinite loop. Our collective, Total Refusal, is interested in exactly doing such performances or films created in this particular media. But the massive use of the artistic appropriation of GTA 5 makes us hesitate to work within the world of Los Santos. Nevertheless, we are not just a media guerrilla and an artist collective, but also do research. We hope that we could have translated our approach towards the material of video games and its artistic use by this lecture. In the end, we want to show you the promo video of a new project we are gonna to develop right now.
Hello, my name is Leonhard Müllner, and together with my colleagues Michael Stumpf and Robin Klengel, we found the artist collective Total Refusal Digital Disarmament Movement, our pseudo-Marxist media guerrilla.
Our current project has the working title Inside the Beltway, and it takes a look at the connection between democracy and capitalism.
It will be realized in the frame of the Emare residency in Werkleitz, so it's still in progress. And it will result, on the one hand, in a performance format, in a lecture performance, which will have a duration of about an hour, and it will involve a musician, a narrator, as well as 4 players with their laptops. And on the other hand, it will result in about 30 minutes long, shorter, one-channel film.
Our materials, which we are experimenting with, are the huge and hyper-realistic worlds of mainstream video games, which we are artistically appropriate and where we intervene into in a parasitic way. We approach video games as hyper-capitalist artifacts, which we misuse with humorous but political artistic intentions. Our goal is to convince the art world of the beauty of games and the game scene of the beauty of arts.
Inside the Beltway is devised as a lecture ballet featuring music and dance passages. Technically speaking, Inside the Beltway is an intervention rather than an alteration, which is to say that we don't modify the game, but rather access it like any other player would, but then subsequently ignore the game's intended gameplay, ignore the game's rules. We do this in order to avoid conflict and instead focus on our architectural tour. The goal being to use the game's already present resources, its overwhelming visual landscape and soundscape, in order to tell our own new story.
We find ourselves in the post-apocalyptic Washington DC, which was recreated in huge detail by the game developers of Massive Entertainment. This game, with the title Tom Clancy's The Division 2, is a multiplayer online shooter game. But instead of engaging with the hostile and militaristic gameplay, we talk about the liaison between democracy and capitalism.
In the tour, we will visit places in Washington, D.C., like the office of the mayor, the completely burnt out IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, where the taxes are collected, or the Ronald Reagan Center, which houses government agencies right next door to hedge fund headquarters. And they allow us to talk about the paradoxes in contemporary democracy and its institutions, and to dive into political theory. As an example, we can show you a brief look at the work-in-progress scene at the FBI headquarters. The FBI headquarters represent security politics in architectural form. For economic reasons, the building was constructed in poor concrete from 1962 on. Let's dive into the guts of this stronghold. It is named after J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI and other office bureaus for almost 60 years until his death. The increasing state security, repression, and surveillance are often seen as a return of a strong state. Effectively, however, the state's sovereignty eroded in the process of globalization. Its self-image changed from a formative role to one that focuses on stimulating and managing market activity. Having its sovereignty contested, the state became a security state. By pretending to protect its citizens from terror and danger, by restricting civil rights and the extensive use of methods like racial profiling, as well as by pumping up the military budget, the state demonstrates its potency. In fact, this is a symptom for the loss of sovereignty. And we will also see places like the Albert Pike Memorial, which is a memorial to a Confederate general and a racist, which was toppled in the riots following the killing of George Floyd. But it exists still in the game, so we will also talk about the concrete digital space and its political charge and meaning.
Hi, welcome back to the Q&A session of the talk by Leonhard and Michael. I would like to start with a general question. So, how do you estimate the importance of video games as a political medium for political criticism? And do you think that their potential is fully used currently?
So, I mean, firstly, revenue-wise, it's commonly known now that video games as a medium have long left film and music behind, and we're not questioning the relevance of political discourse in film, so really it makes no sense to question the importance of political discourse in video games, especially given that video games are stuck in this kind of schizophrenic phase where they do work with a lot of political content. Like most mainstream video games have some sort of like martial story involving warfare, toppling governments, police brutality. All these topics do come up in video games, and yet at the same time there's this tendency among a large portion of the gaming community and the developers alike to sort of like pretend that, or to kind of push the whole topic of politics out of gaming, and to make an attempt to keep the playground as a sort of pure politics-free space intact, which of course it can't be, given that we're already working with highly political topics. So the politics are already there, and what's important is to establish different frames to look at these topics and to reevaluate the values that are communicated in video games.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Eugen Pfister pointed out, if you really want to know something about society, about politics of our society, about how people think of our current governments, it's not enough to watch TV shows with political discussions. It's not enough to look at statistics. You have to look at the pop cultural artifacts. You have to look at series and foremost computer games, where our like atmospheric as well as our ideological bias, or the common sense of our society in regards of our political ideology is kind of crystallized.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Another question. Machinimas have been used for many years as a form of artistic intervention. Did the machinimas in the context of art change over the years, especially when you look at the realism of today's games?
I mean, the interest of artists in this media began here in Linz, as we all know, in the Ars Electronica. It began in that moment where games became relevant to market, and therefore relevant to a huge audience, which then kind of consumes this kind of what I said before, this extraction of our political common sense. And this was in the 90s, and it changed a lot because the way of appropriate media really changed. Like it in some like the biggest game development company, one of them like Ubisoft, is not allowing users appropriation at all via modification, via mods, for example, while other game engine are really open to do anything whatsoever, like even multiply the game's scale in 10 times whatsoever. So we are kind of the modding community as well as the machinima community is always relying on what the game development companies allow or not, so we can do things. And one of the biggest and most successful games ever developed, we have discussed beforehand, like is GTA, and there you can use this as a artistical or as a community-related playground.
Mm-hmm. This question now relates to the thing that you mentioned. So what do you think are the motives behind a AAA developer to build this kind of tools? So when you have GTA with this kind of video editor where you can create videos, that you can create films, what do you think are the motives behind that?
It's of course a kind of a multi.
I mean, it's a marketing tool primarily. Really, is what it is. I think everything else would be naive. I mean, it has, of course, potential for appropriation, but primarily it's just a tool that increases game coverage in other media, in connected media like YouTube Let's Plays. So, while as it can be used for different things, I think if we are really asking for the primary motivation, then that would be it, even if it's a simple answer, but that's probably it, yeah.
And I'm sure that the game development companies would claim for it's a democratization. Like, if we are kind of techno-optimist, optimistic, then we would say, yeah, it's technocratic use of this like super-produced high-end technology, which nobody of us can afford to create by him or herself. So, but of course, it's a marketing tool.
Especially that recently we heard the term games as a life service, so to say, where people then create the content to keep a game alive for several years. I think this goes into the direction that you mentioned, that it's like a marketing tool to keep the revenues high of a game.
Well, games as a live service doesn't merely depend on people creating content. It's a general concept referring to, instead of like previously, like maybe a decade ago, you'd have a game coming out and then maybe you'd get like 1 or 2 expansions over a couple of years and then the game would kind of die off and the sequel would come out. Whereas games as a live service is sort of like a model where your games are released in a with rather limited content, and then you kind of drip feed content month by month or in certain, over certain periods to just keep players kind of bound to that game and keep your audience populated, more or less, yeah.
Another question regarding hyperrealism. So you mentioned this term, and I really liked your presentation because you used these avatars who resemble your real self, so to say.
I mean, they're better versions of us.
They're much more handsome, yeah.
So in your point of view, and since you created these own avatars for your presentation, how important is the avatar in the reception of regarding the interaction of the game world? So how does it shape this kind of, the perception of this hyperrealism? How you perceive this game world through your avatar. Does this have an impact on you?
I mean, this is the host in which you're walking through the world. It is the way to perceive the world and consume hyperrealism.
Okay. Thanks. So, just another general question. Where do you think are the boundaries between Machinimas and a game? How would you set these two things apart?
I mean, the one is user-generated film made within the engine of the gaming software, and the game is the game. This is the difference.
I mean, to go back on the avatar question, sorry if I may, because
no
we kind of jumped over that really quickly. Games are really streamlined environments, and that is to say that they really they have a very limited scope of action. And truthfully, there is actually very little you can do in most games. Like the modes of interaction you have in let's say a lot of shooter games are limited to changing your swapping your guns, shooting at things, taking cover, jumping over things, and that's it. Which is really, if you think about it, a very limited scope of action. But games are so streamlined that they kind of make this aspect disappear. They kind of with the visual magic and the presentation, the production values, they kind of drop out the space for reflection that even makes you notice that. And so really, to an extent, because that does, to refer to your avatar question, your avatar really, or the modes of interaction your avatar has is completely determining the possibilities you have to interact with your environment, with your game world. So it's really crucial to how you experience virtual environments in that sense. Yeah, just to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, very insightful. Yes, so there are no more questions by the audience. I think we are finished with your presentation. Many thanks for your time and the very relevant topics that you covered, and also the kind of presentation. I think it was very exciting and a new way to present content. And good luck for your future projects. And yeah, I think we are,
Thank you.
We are done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are now finished with the third talk of the real-time panel. We'll now have in a couple of minutes the talk by Johannes Pfeifer, so stay tuned. Thank you. Okay, welcome back to the last part of the real-time panel. So our last talk will be given by Johannes Pfeifer. He's an alumni of our university, and he worked there on games such as Tropico 6 or Might and Magic 7. Then he worked there as a level designer and also as a game artist. And in his talk, he will provide an overview of how storytelling was realized in the aforementioned titles. So, as last time, please ask questions, and we'll see us then at the Q&A session. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, hello from the pre-recorded past, where I have the pleasure now to share with you some insights on the narrative design and story integration we did with Hero 7 and Tropico 6, share some processes, challenges, fails, and learnings take you a bit on the ride there during the projects while I stayed with Limbic Entertainment, developing these before I now moved on to a small startup where we're working on one of 500. But let's give you a first overview of what we want to talk about. So first, of course, short project highlight. What's Hero 7? What's Tropico 6? To get a rough idea what's the core of it and what's the storytelling narrative means to it. Briefly, what's generally narrative design, and then take a deeper dive into the story integration process, like who's involved, what are the production steps, and what are the narration tools. And then on the second part, it's about the challenges for both projects, for Hero 7 with the Ashan Compendium, for Tropico 6 with these interesting punchlines and the overall story we had to focus on. A specific fail on the Heroes project, which I think is an interesting thing to share, and the learnings, so kind of like narrowing it down to the top 5 learnings from both projects. But let's dive right into the 2 projects. So Hero 7 was developed from early 2014 to September of 2015, adding also an add-on later on. It's a turn-based strategy game with some RPG elements, a bit more narrative heavy for a turn-based strategy game, and it can be clarified or described as an epic tale or epic tales of heroes in honor. And overall, for the narration tools, it has a vast or great mix of text boxes to full cutscenes. Tropico, on the other side, is a city builder, or as it might be referred to, a dictator simulation that we worked on from March 2016 to early 2019. Some add-ons later on follow there as well. And it's really about this tongue-in-cheek political incorrectness, some social criticism. And there it's mainly about voice or partly voice over text boxes and some smaller cutscenes. But briefly, narrative design. It's more than just a story. It might divert a bit from who you're asking. I'm mainly referring to how I learned it, how I actually did it, how we used to define it at Limbic Entertainment on the projects. But here the reference from Jesse Shell, where stories only this tiny little bit somewhere as part of the world experience, it's maybe a bit short, falling in regards to what it should describe. So it really impacts a lot during the production. And there we want to take a closer look and see some of the key aspects of narrative design. Especially when you compare books, movies, and games, it's really about crafting a compelling interactive narrative, where we have this more dimensional thing. While we need to acknowledge the story design and the technical setup, and direct the player through the experience. So create emotional bridges between scenes and challenges, and of course define these systems and tools to deliver the story to the player, and how the player, being an interactive medium, can actually influence it. Writing the story itself is usually part of the writer. Also in our setup was, of course, some smaller texts were done by design and also narrative design, but the overall story, mainly the dialogue, really the overall core of the writing, is done with the partner of the narrative designer, the writer. So, give you a brief overview about these 2 parts. On the top part, it's how which parties were involved in Hero 7. So we had the dev team on the left side. Mainly involved in the narrative part was the game design, content design, where I was a part of it, following down into the narrative design, and of course the technical guys coding. On the publisher side, we had the writers, which were kind of under the helm of the publisher of Ubisoft, the producing, and the IP team. The IP team isn't marked red because they always waved red flags, but they're really specific and caring about being right to the well-established IP. So that all the things that we created from the design side, but also the writers from the writing, was in line with the long-established Might and Magic franchise. And there, basically 2 people from each department got together in weekly meetings, which was the narrative design part on our side, and a narrative producer they had on their side. And they kind of ticked then the internal communication and organization. For Tropico, It was pretty much the same on our side with the published Calypso. They actually had an completely external writing team, which was iHobo. So our weekly meetings consisted then of like the three parties where the writer was present aside from the producer of Calypso on our side. Speaking of writers, with Tropico we had a team of 2 to 3 writers. On Hero 7 it was actually a group of 4 plus a lead writer coordinating in there. And it was interesting and a bit like of a difference for Heroes. We had 2 of the writers being actually part of the design team. So they knew very well what the game and the gameplay was actually about. But we get a bit into that later, how this actually impacted the writing. So to break down the story integration process. Splitting it up a bit, like who's responsible for, is it dev team, writers, or publisher? First, of course, it's like the story outline and narrative setup, which is obviously something that is up to the writing team and the publisher. Here slightly colored the part red to indicate that the IP team was heavily involved, which story they wanted to continue to tell. So that was actually the first thing we got as a brief to get an overview. Hey, we want to tell this story of Ivan's Council taking place in the year of 843, in the year of the dragon, Ray of the Seventh Dragon, and touching like backwards in these certain adventures other counselors or heroes shared. So we had this a bit of like the Game of Thrones like small chamber, like the inner council related to, just proper term slipping my mind. Anyway, what we have these different guys telling some epic tales of the past. We need to incorporate them and address with different campaigns. We had a certain style, and a CGI trailer was produced to set up the mood and announce the game, and also give a pretty solid idea a bit later in the step then what it was actually about. So this realistic, rather mature but darker setup where we have this council room in this like almost church-like huge palace chamber, where we like start every of these adventures. The next part was then like the internal kickoff and workflow definition on the side of Limbic. So all these different departments we said, hey, we want to set up the communication with the writers via Basecamp to keep track it there. We defined how we work with Artisy Draft, where all the written text was going in. For Tropico, on the hero side, we actually stuck rather like to the Word files and some proprietary software Ubisoft used. But here we established early on some clear guidelines for the writers, which was or where the text were actually required and how things were set up inside of Artisy Draft. And then coming over with the API and the custom tool we created into Unreal Engine 4. Unreal Engine 4 we used for Tropico, Hero 7 was used with UDK, so Unreal Engine 3, by the way. Moving on, kickoff team then like with a full crew. So dev team, writers and publishers, we all got together, shared the ideas. The writers pitched like really the story details, expressed where they want to go. We shared some ideas from our side, some limitations, some concerns, and really like kicking it off, gathering some motivation and starting this exciting journey of developing Heroes 7. With Tropico, it was in a similar manner, more like a remote meeting early then, but it was basically the same setup to get it right. Although we introduced some of the campaigns actually later on, so there wasn't like the full picture of the whole thing, but it was more like one step after another and more defining the scope and basic rule books. Defining the narration tools and design briefings is then some of the first tasks we take on the developer side. So for Hero 7, we had this example say, hey, some part needs to be about information. Some information about the story is actually while you play, like environmental storytelling, scripted events. We had a lot of dialogue as one of our main narration tool while playing. So a lot of reading, being voiced over still. And then we had the most expensive category production-wise, it was the watch part, where we had cutscenes, real-time cutscenes, and even like pre-rendered cinematics. So like the coloring indicated a bit how high the effort was. The blue ones was something that was being taken care of by the publisher or external partners. So, brief overview how diverse this actually was. So there was a lot of different narration tools going on Heroes. As mentioned, Tropico was way less. But we get a bit more into the details later on. First, it's about like what came in. So we received a first story draft called Sequentials by the writing team in both cases. And then we did like a reality check. Can we do it with our means, with the scope? What would we need to set up tools-wise, technical limitations, check with the design team how it works. Gather feedback, also on the publisher side, checking with the IP team if it makes sense and works and is in line with what we have planned. And then it was like really the first part being on these, on an office format, commenting, coloring ideas and so on, and getting it before, as mentioned, then bringing in later like the approved versions into Artist-C and the other software. So then next step was walkthroughs and level design to create. So sketch out how the match should look like, what should take place there, which like major events, references we want to collect, and then like break it down really into these different aspects, variations. For Heroes, we referred mainly to some pre-set up Excel sheets. On Tropico, we set it up directly in Artist-C Draft as it's allowed basically as an iteration of it, a bit more flexible, fluid, and also like faster iteration on the story process overall. Script update was then delivered based on what we had to adjust with the vision we had on design and the walkthrough side. And this was, of course, taken by the writers. Again, some reality check and feedback. So the second loop there. And then we got to the map prototype. So really like bringing in the text for the first time, doing the scripting, doing the logic and the gameplay integration. Obviously from the dev team part, right in Unreal Engine 4. Here we see a setup we had in Tropico 6, one of the maps. And then we went to the prototype review, which was done by the publisher, of course, especially the IP team, if really everything worked together, the script, the missions, the setup, and the gameplay alongside. After proving, getting feedback, we implemented that, did the full content implementation, moving on to beta. And we had then another like big content review and QA session, or not a session, it was like a process that started, obviously, which was handled on both sides. So we had the publisher, the big review, but also, of course, internally the QA setting. Balancing and polishing was done accordingly. Also adding some further ideas, making it really interesting, appealing. And finally, the last step was that we had the script being finalized based on our latest updates and ideas and the feedback, and also the voiceovers recorded. The voiceover recording and script final parts was handled by the publisher and the writers, of course. On our side, it was mainly the integration to get it all together and ship it out as a final game. So, taking an in-depth look at the narration tools like designs and usage. As mentioned, we had these different kinds in Hero 7, so I want to dive in there a bit. There were some like happening right on the adventure map. Some during the battles, we had this, as mentioned, mainly like the dialogue between two heroes. We had this like later redone like council stained glass scenes and these kind of like glimpses back in the past, which was indicated through this like time related fog. So we kind of like categorized, as mentioned, the narration tools in different parts. We created concepts for each of them. First defining the needs we had, what we would need to communicate on which level, where it's for the player, where it's like from the stories from the past, where it's actually on the actual adventure map during gameplay, and really like broke down when it should be used, what not, what restrictions it had, what like the general cost was to it, and how we used it then in the script. So each part of the script was then categorized with a certain narrative or narration tool. And we took it even further for certain aspects, for example, like the council hub, which was a bit of our narrative, and like menu hub, where we would then define, okay, depending on which actions the player took, a basic flow diagram, and this say then there, okay, which tools would be used, which actions would lead to which tool, and so on. Just an example for the council structure. Same was done on the adventure map to really like be clear and specific and precise about it, and have a good idea in the early process, the pre-production part of the game, where we just see here worked with some rough mock-ups then. And then we took it like into the engine itself. For example, when we created the cutscenes, which were pre-rendered back then. So we had them set up in UDK, populated them, post the models, we added certain like effects, and used back then Unreal MACHINIMA to record and export them, add the sound, add the animation, then even like export it out, bring it these different like so to say layers, or like render passes actually, which we kind of like wrote our own shaders for, to bring them over to Unreal After Effects and merge it, composite it there to the final result we want to have. With Tropico, we were actually able to work directly and real time in the engine where it was not needed. Here it was a bit more of a tricky setup because we wanted to achieve very distinct style. So I also would encourage you to think a bit outside the box what you want to achieve, how you can achieve it, and it's actually like was a great adventure together with our tech artist to get an interesting idea how we could make this work with the technical opportunities we had. And for all these different jobs, we had then obviously some organization management setups to break it down and see, okay, how much days and time we would have and until when it would be needed to done, and listed, as mentioned before, above over the different campaigns and gameplay and story parts. The main challenges I want to mention for both projects. One is the Ashen Compendium, which is basically a huge kind of like a Bible-esque writing, which is really fantastic and describes a lot of the different factions, the history, what happened before, which parts of history are defined, which you need to keep in mind telling the story, and have a clear like guideline, but also it's important to stay IP conform, that it's something the team of the publisher side actually did themselves, but also handed over to us, this companion, that we can take a look there ourselves, which was nice to have as a guideline, especially being the 7th installment in a series, but it was also quite challenging to really like know that by heart and know what you can do and what not. And on the other side, we had the experience that writing for games and writing for books or movies is quite different, because two of the writers were, as mentioned, game designers themselves. So they had a pretty clear idea what was possible in the game and what not. And one writer was fantastic with dialogue and those really emotional descriptions, but it was like detached from what we could actually show in the game. So mentioning about like indoor scenes of like two emotional lovers was just not possible for us to somehow show with the assets, the game elements we had in a proper way. So we needed to be aware of that and quite cautious rather early on. On Tropico's side, we had also the challenge that all the story and the jokes basically needed to work in these text boxes, which were partly voiced over, as we see here. So as it could be paused at any time, the play speed is totally up to the player. Basically, most of the jokes needed to work inside this one text box. So it was basically a sequence of punchlines at best, still helping to progress the stories and span a wider arc across the whole mission. But it's quite difficult, and it's really great what the writers did there. It took us some time to get there, and I think some missions actually do it better than others, also in regards to how the gameplay is integrated. But it's really like challenging to take all these aspects into account, boil it down, and then bring it really like to these 4 or 5 sentences that make you smirk, giggle, or full out laugh while having some specific relation to what you as the player actually did in the game. And doing so strike a proper, like this cheeky tone, being politically incorrect by still not insulting the wrong people, where you need to be careful, also not being too dark, while it might be interesting, but you can't be like Ricky Gervais at the Golden Globes, where it just like flat out insult everybody. That might backfire. So it's really like this fine dance to strike the right note there, and you need to be aware of that, which was something our producer was quite cautious about, and I think did a well job there to keep that in mind, because sometimes it's just like you want to get a joke in, but you know, some people might not feel the same about it as you do. Speaking of some fails, I just want to, like, also due to the time, bring one example out, which was the Council Hub cutscenes in Hero 7. So the initial thing was that we have like this frozen still life idea set inside this interactive menu, this console chamber. And it was, I would describe it like an optimistic idea, turned out awfully, because there were some specific issues with it. I show you first a clip how it was in the first iteration, and then what we did about it later on. So it was an optimistic idea. We had a certain vision of it, trying to take into various aspects from the storytelling part, what we wanted to tell, what we wanted to show, while trying to compensate not having the setup for the animations, because we really want like to double down on the gameplay side there, and not just spend too much effort and money on some animations, which is only like a few seconds on the other side. But the idea we had just really didn't work out, and we stuck too long to this idea, I think, in kind of like looking back. And we also did a little too late testing, where it might have been way more obvious. So it was like pushed back because a lot of things, as you saw in the story integration process with the voiceovers and so on, need to be done beforehand. And then the feedback that it was like just bad was too late. Also, like the direct speech was a bit of an issue, because this frozen still life, it might work when you're looking back, when you're telling about something. Well, having people speak and you show them and they're not moving their lips is obviously way more apparent. The visual quality could not overshadow it, as in I think some of their hopes have been, and there was just like too little time to make it appealing or find like another approach to like circumvent it or like redo it. And being some like introductory videos to the actual campaigns, first things some players might even see, made the issue even worse, more apparent and more lasting in the impression of the players. So just give you an idea how that actually looked.
Our enemy tires as well. Duke Seamus of Stag has offered us a truce. If I kneel to him and call him Emperor, he'll make his daughter my bride and me Archduke of his Eastern Realm.
After all he has done, you would be putting a monster on the throne.
The Dukes of Griffin do not bow to lesser men. But this proposal shows that our enemies are on the brink of rupture.
Right. So, what we did about it, kind of like solution, more of like a mitigation. You know what I mean. What we did about it. So, basically, we ended up with a complete overhaul of the scenes, and it's really thanks to Ubisoft, who committed to it and allowed us and helped us creating like this Council Hub 2.0, redoing it using like different types of videos. We focused more on a lively map instead of the councillors themselves, and also still adding some idle animations to give it this feeling of movement, of liveliness. But as an overview here, like all these parts or scenes were actually scrapped, these narration parts, and replaced with new elements. For example, these campaign intro cutscenes, where we did like an overview, what it would cost, how much time you would need to spend on our side, which were like the drawbacks and the advantages. And this is basically what then came out as a result afterwards, which was released together with the add-on.
Overlook. Seamus has the support of the Church of Light, and I do not.
Many within the Church are on our side, Duke Ivan. When the moment comes, they will be behind you.
I certainly hope so, Murizel. and I appreciate your efforts to rally them to our cause. But what of Elrath? So far he has been silent, but maybe that's because he's fine with the idea of Seamus sitting on the throne. What can I hope to achieve if the dragons have already ordained our fates?
No fate but what hand makes.
Overlook.
Right. So we see we really like focused more on the things we could animate, we could control. We still had no like facial animations and so on, but we could like convey the impression that the things were alive and focus on what we could do, what we could animate ourselves, and rather like focus on the strength on the actual map, which was the direct translation to the adventure map the players played on. So just to quickly like nail down the top 5 learnings from both projects, I'd say first is like plan really like in detail with designs, with technical requirements, with the scope in mind, what you want to do early on, like all really like write it down early in pre-production to have a really clear picture about it and don't overcomplicate it. So I think some of our generation tools, I think the vast scope was a bit like too wide, and we could have focused on or double down on some of our stronger suits there. With Tropico, we reduced it already a bit and did not do something too crazy with it. But I think it's good to focus there, still acknowledging what elements your project and your story needs. And the story vision and the technical possibilities need to work together, and you should like test and early challenge it, as we did not do it with our console hub. Fourth, we made experience again and again. It's really even more entertaining and fun when the gameplay and the story is close. So if it's too detached, you might get these giggles, this laugh, this brief emotional spikes, but it's then too detached from what you're actually doing while playing. It feels a bit confusing, and it's just great to literally be able to visually relate to what you tell and experience. It makes it even stronger and helps you like to build on the specific strength of a video game compared to movie, for example. And lastly, it's obviously know your audience. It's quite an obvious one, but it's really important that you have specifically in mind who are your players? What do they enjoy? What do they expect, especially from an established franchise? And who are like the guys you can insult, make some fun with? Where you should be careful? Where do you release the game? What's the cultural background of your audience there? And keep that in mind a bit. But this concludes basically the brief rush on like the narrative design and story integration we did with these 2 projects. Hope you could take something away, and then there should be some more times for questions now. Thank you.
Hello, welcome back to the Q&A session of the talk from Johannes. I'm very happy to have him here in person so that we can have a discussion. So let's start with the questions by the audience. And we have one by Alexander Wilhelm. And he raises the question, what do you think about stereotypes, story-wise or design-wise? Can they be useful, or is there any danger to it?
I think it's in any case good to know about them. So it's really depending on what story you're telling and which audience you're addressing. For example, with Tropico, we dealt a lot with stereotypes, addressing them sometimes in a like positive way, sometimes making a bit fun of some. And then it's really up what story you want to tell, what you want to convey. And it is important to know, but it's important to be aware how you want to approach or address them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question. How do you see the relation between games and other media concerning their design processes and tools to create engaging stories? So do you can see a kind of a convergence, or is it even so that these kind of different disciplines merge together, or is this something completely different? So creating or telling a story in a cutscene is completely different when you compare it to an in-game game scenario.
Yeah, I think for once, games still being a rather young medium is able to learn and draw a lot from the classic storytelling of books and movies. But as one of the earlier slides showed, there's a bit of a difference. We have this more interactive element, which we don't have in other media. So we can relate a lot to like some established techniques, something that works in movies already, when we have something where the player doesn't have too much of control. But then it's really about acknowledging what kind of interactive opportunities the player has. And there it's quite interesting to use like additional means and just the opportunities itself, that the player can be part of the story. So I think there were some more like convergence of the media itself, but it's more and more that games define their needs themselves and push it for a very specific, like becoming their own approach, so to say, without just relating to all what movies, television, and books showed before. So I think the whole interactive part, it's not only games, it's interactive installations and so on, can be something that builds on this, but strives more in its own direction, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Another question regarding the IP. So you mentioned many aspects of IP. So how difficult was it for you to transfer the story from one part, so to say, Tropico 5 to 6? So which kind of legacy did you encounter, or was it hard for you to? I think it would be rather difficult to be innovative on the one hand, but also keeping the storytelling consistent. So you have a player base who have some expectations regarding the game, and on the other hand, to create something new.
Yeah, sure. It's part of the excitement, so really being able to work on such an established franchise. And in both cases, like with Heroes and Tropico, it was the first time that we as Limbic Entertainment had the opportunity to work on such an established franchise. And then it's really about like striking this balance to stay true to its core, the actual like the soul of what makes a Tropico game, and identify what it really is, what part of design, what part of the story defines it, and then build up on this. So it's rather more an evolution instead of a revolution. And that's also something that both sides, in both projects, the publishers were quite careful about. So people always, or the players oftentimes, they are longing for progression, for new features, but they still want to play another installment of the games they still love. And there you can, I think, only alter so much. Especially when speaking with games. With Heroes, we had this Shadow Council setup where we had a lot of input from players beforehand, and there's also a bit the tricky challenge to understand what they say and interpret it, what they actually mean with it. So how far you can and want to go, and it's a bit of like testing and trying to find the sweet spots, how much you want take the next step, or how big the next step is actually.
Mm-hmm. In your talks, you talked about two games, Tropico 6 and Hero 7, with a focus on storytelling. So, and my question is, can you transfer the findings that you gathered by creating these, or co-worked on these titles? Can these findings transferred to other genres as well? When I think about an action-adventure game, or do they entail different kind of storytelling mechanisms, so to say?
Yeah, I think the general collaboration from the process, it can be quite similar. Of course, every project, even with Tropico and with Heroes, still both being rather in the strategic section, it's already different. But you still have these kind of like the developer party, the writing, the producing. Maybe some of this is internally, but you still have these different factors together with design and technology. You need to merge, combine, and work together with these different departments. So you can draw a lot from this, kind of define a general approach which works for you as a company. I think it's also something that might vary quite a bit depending on how your company is set up. But then it can be a good starting point. So that's also what we used in Limbic, to say, okay, we build it up from there, kind of benefit from the learnings we had from the setup and the pipelines we already established, and then adjust it based on the project needs.
So I think even if you would go now for like a first-person shooter or a top-down game, it would still be a similar process how you approach an actual story by first thinking of like what might the franchise or the actual IP have as a requirement, if it's a new one, what you want to actually address, convey, and build step by step up from there, and have these different iterations as the process actually showed.
The next question also is based on the answers that you gave now. Since you mentioned different actors in creating a game, so we have the story department, you have the level design department. Especially in your case, since you worked as a level designer, also were responsible for storytelling in general, where do you think level design and storytelling come together? Is there some kind of a relation between the two? How do you think are the mechanisms? How can a story writer work with a level designer to create an engaging experience?
I think obviously it's the environmental storytelling aspect, if it's really about level design. But I think there's actually a lot more you can build on, because the level design, defines the basic setup, the space for the player. And even by that, you can create this setup which is needed for a certain narrative aspect. So just by defining how vast, how narrow, how like maybe claustrophobic the space actually is, can be something. And so it's important that we have the writers and level designers, the content designers, rather early on aboard, getting together with these kickoff meetings, like these iterations we had in between, that also these guys like speak together, or maybe just being managed by a narrative designer, which is kind of like the connecting part in between. At least it was a similar process on our side, but something like a quest designer does a similar way. And there, I think different companies have different setups, how they can work together, but like all the different aspects from like bringing the technological setup into the visualization and actually the space the player can then interactively manipulate and experience the story. It's important to have all these different players aboard.
And one last question that deals more with technology. So how do you think certain technologies shape the telling of a story? So when you think about games like Witcher 3 have now been ported to a Switch device, which can be played on mobile. So the question would be, would a game like Tropico 6 also be playable on a portable device, and how the stories could be told with such an end device? Do you think there are differences that you have to accommodate as a designer to are there certain issues that you have to address?
Yeah, absolutely. You need to be aware, aside from your audience, especially about the medium you want to use and the technical limitations. If it's just like, what is your target specs, what's the console, and on the other side, what type of game are you? Are you really doubling down on emotions? So you want to have like faces, mimic changes of the players, where it's important to be able to go that close, which has a rather high technological demand, so to say, while games which you like observe more from a distance with lower graphic specs, it's a bit of a different topic there. And I think bit of a major aspect you need to incorporate or think about early on. And with the recent development, especially of motion capture, facial performances, being able to capture and incorporate it more easily, especially Unreal Engine, we were currently working with in our project, offers more and more easily accessible. So I think it's way easier to strive for some emotional-driven narrative games and less about some more like logical puzzle or strategic ones, where it's actually more about the gameplay and less about the narrative aspects to it. So I think it's way easier, and overall probably we'll see more narrative driven games, or where the narrative plays a major role in it.
So thank you. Very interesting talk, and very interesting insights that you provided. We are now at the end of the real-time panel, so we'll have now a short break, and we'll continue at 15:30 with we'll begin the art and industry panel with 2 talks from Miroshot, so Roman Rapak, and also Kate Andrews will give a talk. So until then, please stay tuned and we'll see you next time.